Content warning. This episode contains detailed discussions of child abuse, torture, and murder. The case involves extreme physical and psychological abuse of a disabled child, including descriptions of starvation, hypothermia, and torture methods. Listener discretion is strongly advised. For months, 15-year-old Timothy Ferguson lived in a basement closet that reeked of urine and feces. His mother had installed motion sensors that would trigger alarms if he moved. She forced him to eat bread soaked in some of the world's hottest chili sauce, Carolina Reaper, and Trinidad scorpion peppers that caused excruciating pain. When that wasn't enough punishment, she made him sit in ice baths for hours. On July 6, 2022, after spending 9 straight hours in freezing water, Timothy Ferguson died weighing just 69 pounds, less than half what a healthy teenager should weigh. Intent. It's what separates accident from murder, passion from premeditation, justice from revenge. It is not the act itself, but the intent behind it that makes it a crime. Today on Deadly Intent, we're examining a case that challenges everything we think we know about maternal love. A successful law clerk, a devoted mother to some of her children, a woman studying to become an attorney, who systematically tortured her disabled son to death. The question that haunts everyone who studied this case isn't just what she did, but why she chose one child to suffer while protecting the others. What transforms a mother into a tormentor? And how does love become indistinguishable from hate? I'm Carman Carrion, and if you know me from Freaky Folklore or Destination Terror, you know I've spent years exploring the dark corners of human imagination. But I've learned that the most terrifying monsters aren't hiding in folklore. They're sometimes hiding in our own homes. Welcome back to Deadly Intent, where we examine the criminal cases that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Today's case hits particularly close to home for me as a mother. We're looking at a crime so horrific that experienced detectives still struggle to discuss it without emotion. This isn't just about child abuse. This is about the systematic torture and murder of a vulnerable teenager by the one person who should have protected him above all others. The death of Timothy Ferguson forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we view disability, how we define motherhood, and what happens when the person meant to be your protector becomes your greatest threat. Because understanding the intent behind Shanda Vander Ark's actions, that's the key to understanding how a crime this unthinkable could happen in suburban Michigan in 2022. Norton Shores, Michigan, July 2022. From the outside, the gray house at the end of Matthews Road looked unremarkable, the kind of quiet suburban home where neighbors minded their own business and children played in backyards during long summer days. Inside that house lived Shanda Vander Ark, 43, a woman who seemed to embody success and responsibility. She had recently passed the bar exam on her first try and was clerking for a judge at the very courthouse where she would later stand trial. She was working toward becoming an attorney, managing a household with her husband Adam and their children, and even maintained a YouTube channel featuring her service dog, a Great Dane that helped manage her diabetes. To anyone who might have glimpsed her professional life, Shanda appeared to be everything we expect from successful working mothers: organized, intelligent, driven. She had overcome challenges, rebuilt her life after a difficult divorce, and was pursuing a legal career that demanded both intellectual rigor and moral character. But behind the unremarkable gray facade of that house on Matthews Road, something unthinkable was happening. Timothy Ferguson, 15 years old, had been living with his mother for just over a year when he died on July 6, 2022. Timothy had high-functioning autism, ADHD, bipolar disorder, and several other developmental challenges that made him especially vulnerable. He needed extra care, extra patience, extra love. Instead, he got systematic torture. The story of how Timothy ended up in that house is complicated and heartbreaking. His parents had divorced in 2012 when Timothy was just 5 years old. At that time, Shanda voluntarily surrendered custody of all 4 of her children to her ex-husband, Eric Ferguson. Court documents showed she was granted only supervised visitation, 3 hours per month. For years, Timothy lived safely with his father in Oklahoma. But in early 2021, Eric contacted Shanda with devastating news. He was struggling to care for Timothy and needed her to take him back. According to Shanda's later testimony, Eric told her that if she didn't take Timothy, he would surrender him to the state child welfare system. So in May 2021, 15-year-old Timothy Ferguson moved into the house on Matthews Road with his mother, her husband Adam, and his older brother Paul Ferguson, who was 19 at the time. What should have been a chance for Timothy to reconnect with his mother became the beginning of the end of his life. Let's pause here and consider the question of intent. When a mother agrees to take back a child she voluntarily gave up years earlier, what drives that decision? In most cases, we might expect maternal instinct, guilt over the lost years, genuine love for the child, or at least a sense of responsibility. But the evidence suggests that Shanda Vander Ark's intent was different from the very beginning. Court records show that during her original custody case in 2012, there had been allegations of abuse, the same kinds of allegations that would eventually prove true a decade later. When she voluntarily surrendered custody, it wasn't because she couldn't care for the children. It was because she chose not to. When Timothy arrived at the house on Matthews Road in May 2021, Shanda didn't set up a bedroom for him upstairs with his brother. She didn't enroll him in programs for children with special needs. She didn't seek out resources to help better understand his disabilities. Instead, she put him in the basement. From the moment Timothy entered that house, the evidence suggests that Shanda's intent was not to parent him, but to control him, not to help him manage his disabilities, but to punish him for having them. Modern forensic psychologists have identified a specific pattern in cases like this: the scapegoat child. In families where systematic abuse occurs, one child is often singled out to bear the brunt of a parent's rage, frustration, or psychological dysfunction, while other children in the same household may be treated normally or even protectively. The question is why Timothy became the scapegoat. Was it his disabilities? Was it guilt and resentment over the years she'd missed? Was it something deeper, a fundamental inability to see him as worthy of love and protection? Whatever the reason, the intent was clear from the beginning. Timothy was not coming home to be loved. He was coming home to be punished. January 2022. Timothy had been living with his mother for 8 months when his stepfather Adam suffered a stroke. Unable to navigate stairs, Adam had to move in with his parents, leaving Shanda alone with Timothy, Paul, and her youngest son, known in court records only as G. It was after Adam left that the systematic torture began in earnest. Shanda installed cameras throughout the house, not for security, but for surveillance. She placed motion sensors that would trigger alarms whenever Timothy moved. She put locks on the refrigerator, freezer, and pantry. Timothy was moved into a small closet under the basement stairs, a space barely large enough for a child's body, containing nothing but a blue tarp and an Amazon box. The room had no ventilation, no heating, no proper bedding. It smelled overwhelming of urine and feces. This became Timothy's bedroom. This became his world. The abuse escalated quickly. Shanda began systematically starving Timothy, cutting off his access to regular meals. When he was fed, it was often bread, soaked in Elijah's Extreme Regret hot sauce, a condiment made from Carolina Reaper and Trinidad scorpion peppers, 2 of the world's hottest chili varieties. The pain from this sauce is indescribable. Carolina Reaper peppers measure over 2 million Scoville heat units. For comparison, pepper spray used by police measures around 500,000 units. Forcing a child to eat this wasn't punishment, it was chemical torture. But Shanda wasn't torturing Timothy alone. She had help from Paul, Timothy's older brother. Paul later testified that he felt something close to Stockholm Syndrome with his mother, that his low self-esteem and desire for approval led him to do anything to make her proud, even if it meant torturing his younger brother. The text messages between Shanda and Paul reveal the calculated nature of their cruelty. "He's already pressing every one of my buttons," Paul texted his mother about Timothy. "The whole shaking and 'I need support' crap. I'm ready to slam him into the ground. He also wet the bed and is covered in urine," Paul wrote in another message. But it was Shanda who orchestrated the punishments. It was Shanda who suggested creative ways to cause Timothy pain. In one text exchange that still haunts investigators, she asked Paul about pouring hot sauce on Timothy's genitals. The torture methods were medieval in their cruelty. Ice baths that lasted for hours, leaving Timothy shaking uncontrollably and possibly hypothermic. Forced standing against walls for entire nights. Being handcuffed and zip-tied to prevent movement. Being deprived of sleep for days at a time. Timothy was forced to perform wall sits and run up and down stairs until he collapsed with exhaustion. He was allowed to wear only an adult diaper. No clothes, no dignity, no protection from the cold basement. Through it all, Shanda maintained her professional life. She went to work at the courthouse each day, presenting herself as a competent law clerk studying to become an attorney. She posted videos to her YouTube channel about her service dog. She managed her own health conditions, diabetes that required careful monitoring and accommodation, but she denied those same accommodations to her disabled son. July 5th, 2022, the last day of Timothy Ferguson's life. By this point, Timothy was skeletal. At 15 years old and 68 inches tall, he weighed just 69 pounds. He had no body fat and few ligaments left attached to his bones. He was so malnourished that his body was literally consuming itself to survive. But the torture wasn't over. Text messages show that throughout July 5th, Shanda continued to instruct Paul on how to torment their dying victim. Timothy was unresponsive that morning, his body shutting down from months of systematic abuse. But instead of seeking medical help, Shanda told Paul to use painful methods to wake him up. She instructed Paul to put Timothy in an ice bath and keep him there. For 9 hours, Timothy Ferguson sat in freezing water while his body slowly shut down. 9 hours of hypothermia on top of months of starvation. Shanda texted Paul instructions throughout the day. Make him uncomfortable. When Timothy showed signs of responding to the smell of food, she told Paul to wave it near his face, then pull it away. The cruelty was calculated, systematic, relentless. Surveillance cameras captured Timothy's final moments. He's seen being dragged from the ice bath back to the tiny closet. Shanda covers him with the blue tarp, calling him pathetic. His eyes are open but unmoving. That was the last time Timothy Ferguson was seen alive. On the morning of July 6, 2022, Paul attempted CPR for 18 minutes before they called 911. By then, it was far too late. Timothy had died from a combination of malnutrition and hypothermia. Essentially, he had been tortured to death. When police arrived, Shanda initially claimed Timothy had been injured falling from a bunk bed, but investigators immediately recognized the signs of systematic abuse. Timothy's body told the story of months of torture. The locked refrigerator and freezer told the story of deliberate starvation. The basement closet told the story of dehumanization. The text messages between Shanda and Paul told the story of premeditated cruelty. As we examine Shanda Vander Ark's intent, we have to grapple with a disturbing question. How does a mother decide to torture her own child to death? The evidence shows this wasn't a case of abuse escalating out of control. This wasn't a parent who lost their temper and went too far. This was systematic, calculated, and sustained over more than a year. Shanda's text messages reveal someone who viewed Timothy's suffering as entertainment, someone who took pleasure in designing new forms of torture, someone who saw her disabled son not as a child needing help, but as an object deserving punishment. But why Timothy specifically? Why not Paul, who lived in the same house? Why not G, who was much younger and more vulnerable? Forensic psychologists who study this case identified several factors that likely contributed to Timothy being selected as the scapegoat child. His disabilities made him an easy target, someone who couldn't effectively fight back or escape. His history of living with his father may have made him feel like an outsider in Shanda's reconstructed family. His needs for accommodation and special care may have triggered resentment in someone who saw disability as a character flaw rather than a medical condition. But perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Shanda viewed Timothy's disabilities as deliberate defiance rather than neurological differences. Throughout the abuse, she consistently accused him of faking his symptoms. In her mind, his autism-related behaviors weren't medical conditions requiring understanding. They were acts of rebellion requiring punishment. This is a pattern seen in other cases of disabled children being abused or killed by their caregivers. The abuser reframes medical needs as behavioral choices, neurological differences as willful disobedience. Shanda's intent wasn't just to control Timothy's behavior. It was to eliminate Timothy's identity. She stripped him of his name, referring to him only as her problem child. She stripped him of his clothing, his privacy, his dignity. She stripped him of his humanity. The torture wasn't designed to teach Timothy anything or correct his behavior. It was designed to break him completely. And when that breaking became dying, she continued anyway. The investigation into Timothy's death began immediately. But for detectives who had seen decades of child abuse cases, this one stood apart. Lieutenant Joel Hoeksema of the Norton Shores Police Department later described having to read descriptions of the surveillance footage to the jury because the judge deemed the actual video too horrific to show in court. Dr. Joyce DeYoung, the Muskegon County medical examiner, testified that in her years of performing autopsies, she had never seen a case of malnutrition this severe in the United States. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Timothy's body showed signs of prolonged torture. The house contained locks on food storage, surveillance equipment designed to monitor a child, and the basement closet that served as Timothy's prison. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Shanda and Paul's own text messages, hundreds of communications documenting their systematic torture of Timothy in real time. They weren't messages between strangers planning a crime. These were messages between a mother and a son, casually discussing the best ways to cause pain to a disabled child. Paul Ferguson agreed to testify against his mother in exchange for a plea deal. In December 2023, he took the stand and detailed the abuse he had helped inflict on his younger brother. "I haven't had it diagnosed and I don't know how to explain it, but I'd say it's something close to Stockholm Syndrome." Paul testified about his relationship with his mother. "I desire to find a role model that, due to my own low self-esteem, I would do anything to make them proud of me." Paul's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, but it also revealed the complex dynamics of abuse within the household. When Shanda Vander Ark took the stand in her own defense, she presented a starkly different version of events. She claimed she had been struggling with her own health issues and gaps in memory. She blamed Paul for many of the worst acts of torture. She insisted she never intended to hurt Timothy. "I feel like a complete failure," she told the jury. But when prosecution showed her photographs of Timothy's emaciated body, Shanda vomited on the stand, a reaction that many observers interpreted as guilt rather than grief. Her defense attorney, Fred Johnson, argued that Shanda suffered from mental health issues that prevented her from understanding the harm she was causing. He painted her as a woman overwhelmed by circumstances, not a calculating abuser. "We're not looking at evil," Johnson told the jury. "We're looking at sick." But prosecutor Matt Roberts painted a different picture of a woman intelligent enough to pass the bar exam and hold down a professional job, but who chose to torture her disabled son. "All of the things that she did," Roberts said, "are so callous, are so cold, that they defy explanation. She had stopped thinking of her children as human beings." The jury deliberated for just over an hour before finding Shanda Vander Ark guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. January 23, 2024, Shanda Vander Ark stood before Judge Matthew Cassell for sentencing. For the families of abuse victims, sentencing hearings are often the only opportunity to speak directly to the person who caused their pain. Timothy's sister, Millie Ferguson, delivered a victim impact statement that captured the devastating loss of her brother. "I regret not hugging him more and teasing him so much instead of telling him that I loved him every once in a while. I regret not putting aside my differences with Shanda and Paul just to check in on him. There's no fixing what's been done, no way to redo it all over again, and that's my regret, that I couldn't protect him when he needed me most." Timothy's brother, Nolan Ferguson, was more direct in his anger. "I can't have my brother back. She shouldn't have her freedom back. The life of one sweet little blue-eyed boy is not equivalent to that of a murderer." When given the opportunity to speak, Shanda Vander Ark declined. She shook her head no and remained silent. Judge Cassell did not show the same restraint. "I've been trying now for this entire case to wrap my mind around how somebody could do something so horrific, not only to another human being, but to their own child," Judge Cassell said as he delivered his sentence. "You intentionally and systematically tortured this child. Let's call it what it is. It's torture. You tortured this child." Cassell sentenced Shanda Vander Ark to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder charge, plus 50 to 100 years on the child abuse charge, a sentence that exceeded guidelines because of the extreme nature of Timothy's suffering. Paul Ferguson was sentenced separately in February 2024. Despite his cooperation with prosecutors, Judge Cassell sentenced him to 30 to 100 years in prison, far above sentencing guidelines because his role in Timothy's torture was so extensive. Both sentences reflected the court's recognition that Timothy's death wasn't just murder. It was the systematic destruction of a vulnerable child over more than a year. As we reach the end of our investigation into this case, I keep coming back to the same question. What was Shanda Vander Ark's ultimate intent? We know she intended to hurt Timothy. That's clear from the evidence. We know she intended to control him through fear and pain. But did she intend to kill him? The prosecution argued that the abuse was so severe and sustained that death was inevitable, making this first-degree murder even without explicit intent to kill. But I think Shanda's intent was something even more disturbing than simple murder. I believe her intent was to erase Timothy completely, to eliminate not just his life, but his identity, his dignity, his humanity. She stripped away his name, calling him only her problem child. She stripped away his clothing, his privacy, his basic human needs. She kept him in a basement closet like an unwanted object. Most chilling of all, she consistently denied that his disabilities were real medical conditions, insisting instead that he was faking his symptoms. In her mind, Timothy's autism wasn't a neurological difference requiring accommodation. It was a character flaw requiring punishment. This isn't just ableism. This is the complete dehumanization of a disabled child. Shanda's intent wasn't to fix Timothy's behavior or teach him lessons. Her intent was to break him so completely that nothing of the real Timothy would remain. And in a horrific way, she succeeded. By the time Timothy died, he had been reduced to just 69 pounds of suffering flesh. The cameras captured him in his final months, not fighting, not speaking, not even crying, just existing in a state of broken submission. That wasn't the Timothy his sister remembered dancing with. That wasn't the Timothy his father had tried to protect by giving him up. That was what remained after more than a year of systematic dehumanization. The most disturbing aspect of this case isn't just that a mother tortured her child to death. It's that she did it while maintaining the facade of normalcy in every other aspect of her life. She went to work each day at a courthouse dedicated to justice. She studied law, a profession supposedly committed to protecting the vulnerable. She cared for her service dog with the kind of patience and accommodation she denied her own son. She was capable of love, of responsibility, of professional competence. She chose to withhold all of those qualities from Timothy. The house on Matthews Road in Norton Shores, Michigan still stands. New residents live there now, a family who probably had no idea of the horror that occurred in that basement closet. Timothy Ferguson's death forced Michigan to examine gaps in its child protection systems. It led to discussions about how to better protect disabled children, who are statistically more likely to be abused than their non-disabled peers. But for all the systematic changes that might prevent future tragedies, nothing can bring back the boy who loved to dance at family weddings, who deserved protection and got torture instead. The question that haunts everyone who worked on this case isn't just how Shanda Vander Ark could do what she did. It's how many other Timothy Fergusons might be suffering right now in houses that look perfectly normal from the outside. How many disabled children are being punished for their neurological differences? How many are being told they're faking conditions they can't control? How many are bearing the brunt of a parent's inability to accept that disability is not a moral failing? As a mother, I struggle with the fact that someone who shared that role with me could commit acts of such calculated cruelty. But as someone committed to understanding criminal intent, I recognize that we have to examine these cases, no matter how disturbing, if we want to prevent them. Because the intent behind Timothy's murder wasn't unique to Shanda Vander Ark. The dehumanization of disabled people, the view that different neurologies are character flaws, the belief that some children deserve love while others deserve punishment. These attitudes exist throughout our society. Timothy Ferguson deserved love, patience, understanding, and protection. He deserved accommodations for his disabilities and celebration of his strengths. He deserved to grow up, to find his place in the world, to experience all the joy and possibility that this life should offer. Instead, he got systematic torture from the person who should have been his greatest advocate. The question behind every case we examine here on Deadly Intent is the same. Every killer has a reason, but does reason ever justify murder? In Timothy's case, we know the reason: ableism, scapegoating, the fundamental inability to see a disabled child as worthy of love. There is no justification. Thank you for listening to Deadly Intent. This case was particularly difficult to research and present, but Timothy Ferguson's story deserves to be told. If you or someone you know is struggling with caring for a child with disabilities, please know that resources and support are available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233, and the Child Help National Abuse Hotline is available at 1-800-422-4453. Join us next time as we explore another case where understanding the intent behind the crime helps us understand the darkest corners of human nature. Until then, remember, every child deserves love, protection, and the chance to thrive, regardless of their abilities or challenges.